Hello everyone. Today we will talk about API Gateway. We will discuss what is API Gateway, functionalities of API Gateway, how request through the API Gateway. Let's first understand what API is. API stands for Application Programming Interface, a software intermediary that allows two applications to talk to each other. So next time when you use any application to get data, you are using API. These are the API that can make or break the system. Now you may ask, you have client who requests data, you have API who responds data, so why we need API Gateway? Let's understand it with the help of an example. Suppose we are developing e-commerce project. We have handful of microservices like onboarding, product, cart, inventory, and so on. We are ready with the backend part and now we need to develop frontend. Frontend team comes to us and asks an API for user onboarding. We will give them an API endpoint for the onboarding microservice. So far, so good. Now they need to fetch product. So they come to us again and ask an API for products. This time we have to give them different endpoint, because this API is related with the product microservice. Now you may understand how critical their work would be if they need to fetch data from 10 different microservices. And later on, if we refactor our backend code and split one of our microservice into the two parts, so we will ask our front-end team to redo their work. Now think what went wrong. The answer is we need an abstraction layer. This abstraction layer is API Gateway. This will work between the client request and the collection of services. So API Gateway is a single entry point for all of your client. It sits between the client request and collection of services. Whenever you make any of the requests, it goes to the API Gateway and API Gateway knows where this request will go. Now let's go back to our previous example where we were developing e-commerce project. In this case, we will give a single endpoint to our front-end team. This endpoint will redirect to the API Gateway. All these requests will go to the API Gateway and API Gateway will decide how and when this request will go to the API. So this is the major feature of API Gateway. But API Gateway performs n number of things. Let's discuss them one by one. First, authentication. API Gateway authenticates all the requests that come from the client. It allows only authenticated requests to access the microservice. Next is load balancing. API Gateway check the load of each microservice so that microservice will not be overloaded. Next, protocol translation. If client generate the request in any of the protocol and API or microservice is accepting the request in different protocols, so API Gateway transform the request into the appropriate protocol. Next is monitor and logging. API Gateway monitor all the requests, approve and rejected. We can log the request also for any of our investigation. Next is caching. We can enable the caching on API Gateway. It asks for the capacity. The better capacity we provide to the API Gateway, the better result it provides. Now let's discuss how request through the API Gateway. Step 1. Client send the request to API Gateway. This request is typically HTTP based. It could be REST or GraphQL. Step 2. API Gateway validate the request. Step 3. API Gateway chant the sender IP address and other HTTP header against the approve or reject list. Step 4. API Gateway send it to the identity provider for authentication and authorization. Identity provider knows for what all this request is allowed for. Identity provider provide the authentication session to API Gateway. Step 5. A high rate limit is checked. If the limit is already crossed, the request is rejected. Step 6. API Gateway transform the request into the appropriate protocol. Step 7. API Gateway send this request to the backend API. Step 8. API Gateway get the response from the API and transform it into the public facing protocol. Step 9. API Gateway send the response to the client. So this is the way. These are the steps in that API Gateway get the request, send it to the API and collect the response and send it back to the client. Now let me tell you 3 major challenges that you may face when you integrate API Gateway. First, you integrate the API Gateway between the client request and the collection of services. So you may face a little bit latency. So this is the very obvious challenge and you can't do anything about that. Challenge 2 is when you work with any of the microservice architecture, if any of the microservice gets down, so your system still work. But when you integrate the API Gateway and redirect all your requests to API Gateway, and if it gets down, so nothing works. But you can solve this problem by setting up multiple API gateway and having the load balancer. So if any of your API gateway gets down, so load balancer redirect your request to other API gateway. Challenge 3 is you may have different kinds of clients like web, mobile, IoT devices, iOS, Android, and so on. Each kind of front end needs different kind of configuration. But if you do all these configuration with single API gateway, so this will become too much complicated. To solve this problem, you can set up dedicated API gateway for each type of your client. So this is API gateway in nutshell. Now I think you have clear idea what is API gateway, functionalities of API gateway, how request through the API gateway, challenges with API gateway, and how to solve them. If you have any question, feel free to ask. Until then, stay tuned.